So as I just shared the context, Anil, I'm just documenting how BD and Web3 is kind of interconnected systems, right? And I want to really take this opportunity to learn about your frameworks of DeFi BD. So before we get into the tactical stuff, I would love to hear more about your background. I see like we have kind of a similar arc because I started with EY and I see that you were with Deloitte and then we moved on to Web3 and like it's something which is not really common, but I would love to hear more about your journey, Algorand, then Polygon, and now Katana.
Yeah, maybe I can share a little bit of my background. Thanks, Apit. Thanks for having me on today. Quickly about my background is that like I actually joined the industry in like 2017. So back then it's kind of funny. I joined like a micro VC that was investing quite a bit in like ICOs in general. And like kind of like it was filled with like INSEAD MBA alumni out of Singapore actually. So they were trying to like really go really hard, the GP and LP. So back then we were like investing a lot in ICOs. Spent the better part of like 1.5 years on that front. And then after that, it kind of like gave way to the ICO bust, right? Where like the ICO busted, the retail side busted, and then moved towards like quite a bit in terms of enterprise blockchain. So I was like, hey, like I think it's kind of interesting because we from back then, right, we always knew that the industry was like a hotspot combination of a lot of people coming from a lot of backgrounds, and like the feedback that we always got was that, hey, these people are like, they don't know what they're doing. So I'm like, okay, if I didn't know what I was doing, maybe what I should do is that I should bring myself and join the very best, basically. So that's when I actually joined Deloitte Consulting, and actually in like the most advanced like practice essentially, which is used to be called automation and cognition actually. Okay. So it was the practice that would deliver enterprise blockchain solutions, RPA, even OCR and chatbots actually. So back then I was actually working on like multiple projects like with NTT, like the large Japanese corporation, and then even with like Daimler's called Mercedes today. So I spent a better part of like 1 year there in consulting, working across like different types of projects and programs, and it was really like an eye-opener. You basically require like it kind of like taught me that, hey, there's a lot of things that we can actually translate into Web3 itself, like the industry that we have, and like standard operation procedures, like even PMOing, like that thing didn't exist in our industry. Like it was just, there was no project management back then.
That doesn't exist even today, right? A lot of
that's true. That's true. Yeah, it does not exist even today. So fast forward, I actually joined Tezos as like an ecosystem grants person. Help them to set up like their Asia Pacific grants ecosystem. That's when we had like, you'll give out grants of like 100K or 200K or pop. Back then it was like the cool thing to do. And then also created like a much smaller grant system. That's not as widely adopted right now. But if you think about like in the early days of the Ethereum Foundation, where like L2s and other chains didn't start giving out a large amount of grants, right? The grant sizes coming from EF were really small. If you remember, like teams winning like a 5K EF grant would be like the coolest thing ever. And you were like, oh, like these guys did so well, they got an EF grant for 5K. So like we at Tezos, we started to do like what we call mini grants, and like it has like quite a bit of effect, because if you were an individual, right, and you were trying to like make an application work, 5K would actually push quite a bit on your front actually. So that was one thing that we came out on the Tezos side, and then obviously grew Tezos' Asia Pacific practice to a much larger amount of projects in general. And then from there, kind of like was headhunted to join Algorand Foundation as the head of DeFi. Back then, when I took over the DeFi portfolio, the industry was just getting started with like productization. If you remember, like back then there was nothing, right? There was DeFi, nor there's like NFTs, for example. So Algorand Foundation started to like productize. So I was like, I took over the DeFi portfolio. There was only like three applications, and then I was like, okay, like it's a greenfield. Started growing them, and then like making sure that like borrowed land is taken care of, which we can cover later. The DeFi Legos and stuff like that, and then built up the amount of applications all the way to like 20 plus apps in general. And then came the 3AC and FTX debacle. Had to like manage down. I didn't know that manage down was like an essential skill set of an ecosystem lead back then, which is really funny. But managing down is like as painful as like really growing, because when bear market comes, you have to learn to say no as an ecosystem lead. It's really very challenging, because even when you are saying no, you have to make the right decisions in saying no, actually, and you have to dare to say no much more frequently. So that's really, really interesting. Grew the amount of like algos committed in DeFi applications by a factor of like 20 plus. Like essentially kind of like push in terms of like the amount of algos being used within DeFi to like 10% of their supply. I think it's like much higher now, but a lot of the foundations that we built was from back then. And then that kind of like gave way to me joining Polygon Labs, which is like really interesting because Polygon Labs, and we all know about Polygon, right? Polygon has like very famous for a really product first culture where we would be able to create multiple, we would have multiple products essentially. And like as part of the DeFi team, we kind of like push support for multiple DeFi environments. So for example, there's like DeFi on the egg layer where we support DeFi on Polygon POS where we support DeFi on Katana where the DeFi team also supports essentially. So that's my journey essentially. So kind of like right now at Polygon, I'm more recently at Katana right now where we are pushing growth when it comes to like, applications and the ecosystems themselves and multi ecosystems, in general. Yeah.
And it's like, it's really curious to hear this because like a lot of these experiences, I have had exact same experiences throughout last 5 years. So I started like very early when Polygon was still Matic, and I started contributing on the enterprise BD side exactly. And I have had those conversations where, execs are sitting and then they're laughing, on my face that why would I disrupt this legacy system for something which has not been even tested, right? So I can totally relate to all of that, but it's exciting to see how far we have come since then. So right now, what I understand is like you are wearing two hats, right? So you lead DeFi BD at Polygon, plus you're leading BD at Katana. Is that right, or how does that work?
Yeah, correct. So, but I would say most of my work and my day to day right now is like Katana, like really GTMing and success of Katana. That's like really number one for us. We have a dedicated resource that's like fully committed to Polygon DeFi right now. So he's like fully on DeFi. The DeFi team kind of like works together to make sure that like DeFi functions very well across like all of Polygon's products basically. But each of the products have like a dedicated resource, and like we are like full on into Katana right now.
Got it. Okay. So I think that's awesome, and let's now get into more tactical stuff, right? So the first thing that I want to discuss is around some non-obvious layers of BD, specifically in the context of DeFi, right? So everybody knows about TVL, everybody knows about retail community and traction and all of the integrations that you can do. But what are some of the non-obvious layers of BD in DeFi today, and like how do you break it down as a system?
Yeah, okay, that's a really good question actually. So I will share my model. I'm pretty sure that different leads will have different models about their approach, etc., etc. But let me share mine. So my model is actually very steep in like DeFi Legos essentially, because that's where we kind of like started DeFi with, right? So the way I look at DeFi ecosystems is that you have to look at that approach with like the DeFi Legos in mind. So when you look at DeFi Legos, there's multiple layers. The base layer is gonna be borrow and lend, DEXs, and there could be new inclusions in the base layer. But a lot of the base layer stuff essentially allows you to do one of two things. Number one, it allows the users to make a trade, for example. Or number two, they are able to benefit from certain infrastructure that DeFi can actually provide. So that's like really the base layer of DeFi Lego. And then when you move one step up in terms of like the infrastructure itself, that's when you hear about like DEX aggregators. Nowadays, like lending aggregators are also really popular. Yield optimizers, liquidity managers and stuff. They actually kind of like sit on one layer above whatever that's enabled at the base layer. All right. And then based off of that, you have financial innovations that you see nowadays, like Pendle, for example, when they are trading forwards, they're trading, they're also looking at other products, for example. And you have the split of like the PT and the YT, the principal token and the yield tokens. And then you also look at like whatever other projects can actually provide, such as like Eigen layer or the DA layer can actually bring to DeFi, and the use and how you cut the use to and fro. And that moves up in terms of like the DeFi Lego that you should be thinking about. So my approach in terms of like building out an ecosystem when you're thinking about from 0 to 1 is like, hey, you take care of the base layer first, then take care of the second layer, then take care of the upper layers. Okay, so some people, and DeFi today is much more complicated, right? It's not just like, hey, I have 1, 2, 3 layers and I build that. But if you approach building out an ecosystem from first principles, that's how you should do it. And then you might have certain features and functionalities that cut across all 3 layers. For example, nowadays, intents and solvers are really cutting across multiple layers. So you have like bridges using intents and solvers. You also have DEXs that's also using intents and solvers. So the way you should like visualize it, right, is that like, and what's the upgrade and the move is that it's no longer a 2D pyramid. It's actually a 3D pyramid that turns around, and you can add stacks, like a layer of functionality and a stack behind it. And what happens is that as DeFi continue to evolve, right, instead of like just looking at it from in front, look at it from the side, and the depth of the growth of DeFi is going to keep increasing. So you can grow in 2 points. You grow in DeFi in like the breadth of it, right? and we can grow in DeFi and increasing the pyramid of the DeFi Legos in it. And both, right, are growth, actually. So it really depends on what kind of growth you're trying to gun for. So for example, right, at Katana, we always are looking at like having the deepest liquidity, right? And the highest use, essentially. So a lot of Katana's focus is actually on, if you think about it, like the base layer, the first two layers of DeFi, and making sure that we have a really deep moat. If I'm drawing like the breath right now, it's like first two layers and drawing the moat behind it. And this rectangle that you see here is going to be like the meat of Katana, actually. So that's how you look at ecosystems. So that's what I do. So if you were listening to this and you were like, hey, I'm like maybe at a new chain or a new L2, and like my mode is about like being really good at like being layer 4, like maybe being like the best options DeFi chain in the world, then what you would do is you would look at the DeFi Lego and you would, because you're an options chain, right? Then you'll be on the third slice and you would elongate your third slice into breadth that would like be the mode of your chain. And I always love to tell people, when you look at DeFi, right, you would never have a mode from day one. You would have a comparative advantage. That means you would lead people in certain things. And when you actually lead people in certain things, right, that comparative advantage can one day become a mode, but you have to build towards it becoming a mode, essentially. So that's how I look at it, essentially. How do I break it down in like the mental model? And then when you have like this, when you use this mental model well, then you apply BD, you apply sales, you apply account management, you apply ops, basically. That's how I look at it.
So I think that's very interesting. So what I understand, like it's a stacked approach, right? So there are primitives, and then there are core applications on top of that, and then there are other innovations like eigen and options and perps, etc. Right? So when you say
Correct.
grow the, and then there are certain tech innovations which cut through all of these stacks, which you mentioned. So when you talk about breadth of these Legos, by breadth, do you mean deeper liquidity, more users, or more applications? Like, what's the measure of that breadth that you spoke about?
Okay, that's also a really good question. So when you look at like what I'm saying in terms of the breadth and growing up, right? It's a lot of people can actually visualize growing upwards in terms of the DeFi Lego in 2-dimensional better, because that would mean like just pure raw new innovation that's coming out. So for example, nowadays you see Lighter, right, which is like a perp DEX that's like being traded, like people are really bullish on it. And you also see like, for example, on base, there's like an AI layer that's called like Ray, for example. And when Virtuals was released, it was really, really cool. Those are innovations that will build up in terms of the pyramid. When we talk about the breadth, right, the breadth itself, it's actually you building your comparative advantage into a mode itself. So if we were to talk about the liquidity layer, which is where Katana wants to deliver, right, the liquidity layer is going to be held in two different major applications. It's going to be held in the borrow and lend and the DEX itself. So building the breadth in terms of liquidity layer and building it outwards, right, is exactly, you are right, basically. You're saying that it will build out the liquidity and the breadth and whatever. On the third layer of the pyramid, if it was like, for example, like options, for example, going back to options, if you were to build out that layer, what that would look like is that you would have like a much stronger options train. Maybe instead of going to Bybit, people will go to you, right? If you think about it. And how you build that is like the thickness and the depth and whatever is on that layer itself, and then you build it out. And the interesting thing is this, is that when you build that out far enough, right, you actually would have to slice in new things. So for example, we use the example such as intents and solvers earlier. So could you use intents and solvers to make your options train that is on that option protocol at the third layer of that pyramid like much stronger, for example? And how would you do that? That would be the role of the head of DeFi. That would be the role of the architect on the team. How do they make it into an actual mode, actually? So you actually do see that like manifesting itself in a lot of the larger applications. Like a good example is like Lido, for example. See Lido having a really strong mode nowadays because they built that breadth, right? And they actually expanded on that breadth much deeper in the early days. Same for Pendo, building that breadth now, and they're going really strong in it. So Hyperliquid is doing the same exact thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting, and it makes a lot of sense because it's not about how many projects do you have in your ecosystem. It is about how deeply are they embedded in your
Yes,
ecosystem, right? And how deeply are
correct.
they really building? So yeah. So I think that's a really interesting takeaway here, because a lot of times pretty much everybody is doing logo hunting, but that leads to pretty much nothing eventually, and you realize that very late in the cycle. But this is interesting. So, and I think let's now move on to a second very related question here, and which is something which I have faced pretty much anybody who is working at a emerging layer two or a project which just started. And Katana, I don't put it in that category because yes, it is still new, but it has all the power of Polygon behind it, right? So for a emerging layer two or a protocol, right? So to move ahead of this cold start region that everybody starts at, right? So what are some of the
Yes.
frameworks that are, or maybe a playbook of sorts? If
Hmm.
there is a new layer two in DeFi, for example, for Katana, what is your playbook like? So I understand the BD aspect of it, growing depth, creating a moat, especially on the primitive side, because once the primitives are set, liquidity is there, users will come. When users will come, applications will
Correct.
come. Applications will come, they will eventually evolve into more and more nuanced products. Other than
Correct.
that, what are the other components of this playbook that you are seeing unfold at Katana, and something which can be used by other chains in a similar?
Yeah, I think what you've just shared is like really critical for any head of DeFi in general. So you build your primitives and then you build outwards. I think one thing that I've learned from past experience is that like even before you start hammering into your vertical, you have to take a step back. And what I mean by taking a step back is that even if you're the head of NFTs, you're the head of gaming, or you're head of whatever in whatever ecosystem, right? Or you, like, for example, update like yourself, the head of the full ecosystem itself. What I'll do is I'll take a step back and I'll ask myself from like first principles. Actually, what is this chain trying to achieve, and what are the incumbents? What have the incumbents actually achieved? For example, a good example is like Ethereum, right? So Ethereum has achieved like escape velocity. DeFi, Ethereum has achieved escape velocity 1, 2, 3, 4, like NFTs, blah, blah, blah. So you know what's your incumbent audiences and what's your incumbent users. From there, right, what you could potentially do is you could expand outwards. Like, for example, the one thing that a lot of specific vertical leads fail to account for is that they fail to account for how you can collaborate with other verticals. Like if you were the head of DeFi, but you were the head of DeFi for a gaming chain, for example, then the way you have to approach your DeFi is going to be very, very different, right, from head of DeFi for a DeFi chain. So what you have to do if you're head of DeFi of a gaming chain, definitely look at GameFi a lot more. Definitely look at like, hey, how can I define that? Once again, that pyramid that I'm trying to build. Maybe if I'm on a very strong GameFi chain, my base primitive shouldn't even be a borrow and lend, shouldn't even be a DEX. Maybe what I could do is I could just go to like Ethereum. I could draw on the liquidity coming from there. So why am I as a head of DeFi paying for that liquidity? Maybe I could like work with a really large chain or a really large provider, and then that would solve a lot of my issues. So if you approach it from the first principles perspective, and you really sat down and you really look at the macro of what a chain demands, right? Your pyramid, right, is actually going to look very different from what a traditional head of DeFi's pyramid is going to look. And that's where you put in a lot of like your applications in terms of like the infrastructure, and then you actually build that out. So for example, if I was on a consumer chain, like a consumer chain that's focused on uh like maybe media, for example, I probably wouldn't have like a borrow and lend at the base layer. What I would have is that I would focus a lot more on the DEX itself. So DEX becomes my primary. After the DEX itself, I will maybe focus a lot on the new optimizers, because I know that like if somebody's like playing an RPG game on my layer, what they want to do is that they want to like land out the goal that they have, or something, right? So that would mean that they will want to earn a yield on it much quicker. And then maybe from there you could bring like a smaller borrow and lend, or adopt a borrow and lend coming from a cross chain, leveraging on the infrastructure and actually grow outwards. So like that's what I would actually do if like you were starting a new environment or new layer to think of things from like first principles, what the business or what the foundation or what the labs really needs, and actually lean into the specific genre or niche that defines your subcategory. Try what I would do is try not to go with the cookie cutter approach, even though like it could be like, for example, if you were to drop me in a role tomorrow, I would definitely use the cookie cutter build. I'm just being very honest here. But if I had time, I had like 10 days to sit down and actually think, right? Then you like even for yourself, Upbeat, and anyone that's out there that are ecosystem leads, you guys will probably be able to come up with like much stronger ways of approaching it. And like it's funny because like when I'm answering this question, right, it's very similar to me answering question one, because I've actually just been using this framework a lot across like everything essentially. So if it's a question for an NFT lead, right, I'll also use the same pyramid and I'll use the same framework because it actually just works. Yeah, that's what I found.
Yeah, I think that's right, because the beauty of, and what you said, cookie cutter approach, I look at it differently, right? So these are the things of frameworks that we have kind of created after pretty much doing all the mistakes there are to do in Web3 BD, right? So we have made all the mistakes, we have seen what works, what doesn't work. So everybody does. So I do have a framework of how to approach ecosystem building slightly different. So basically because I have never been other than Polygon in early days where I was leading in the
Mm,
enterprise side of things, I have never been in a vertical specific role. Like I have been more on the general ecosystem side. So I have, for me, like I look at ecosystem in 7 different layers, and then you can optimize which layers to put effort into depending on what you are, which is very similar to what you said, right? So if you are a layer 2 which just got launched, you really need to understand what your end objective is. But I have experienced that that question is not that answer, that answer, any chain which just launched, they generally do not switch, or they do not kind of commit to one use case or a different use case, or maybe even sectors. Somebody who is building a general purpose layer 2, they are not able to commit to an enterprise side of things or to the DeFi side of things. So they want to build for everybody. And then a point comes when they realize that you can't do that, right? You have to really pick and choose what you want to optimize for. But yeah, I agree that like that framework will definitely work. So you will have to put in these flavors. For example, right now, I am kind of customizing everything from a DeFi standpoint. From Ether, you are doing it from the DeFi side. But that's so. And again, let's move on to some of the initiatives that you must have taken earlier, right? Which didn't work out. Like systemically, what were some of the things? And of course, you need not tell me the specifics of it. But the idea here is to understand, like, systemically, what are the things that could have been done better to ensure that these initiatives didn't go wrong?
Yeah. I think what I'll do is I'll take a step back and kind of like share a little bit more about like in the initial days when I kind of joined, and then like we were pushing out a lot on the Asia Pacific side. I think one thing that what a lot of people do not notice is that like I think cultural lines are really, really important. And what I mean by that is like I think you know where I'm gunning it. So like if you look at crypto, right, crypto is very much like it's a global thing, right? We all agree that it's a global thing. Different cultures have different ways of like doing things in general. And I think that's where a large part of like what initiatives could look like would land very, very differently. So for example, right, if you were to look at, I'm just generalizing, obviously, it's not applicable to everyone, but if you were to look at the difference between Asia and like Europe and the US, I always love to like use this example. And that is that like for US initiatives, right, they start at 100% confidence level. So 100 points. And then for each mistake that's done, the points decrease and decrease and decrease until the trust completely is eroded, right? If you go to Europe actually requires you to earn the trust. So in Europe, you start from 0, and then over time you earn that 1 point, 2 point, 3 points, and then once you hit like 100 or whatever, even if you were to make a mistake, people kind of like understand, and they will be able to like work with you. And if you look at Asia plus, just in general, like the greater Asia countries like Japan, India, in this region, it's always like at 50. And it's always 50 plus some kind of a trust factor that is outside of this point system. So people might be overperforming or underperforming, but if the trust is built up already, then they would be able to like, hey, like it's okay. I understand this guy. Like I've been working with him for X amount of months. I know how he thinks. And if I can logically rationalize, then it's fine. I understand where he's coming from. Here's the thing is that when you put 3 really large cultural and continents like areas together, and you're trying to ship one initiative, everybody thinks differently. So, for example, you put somebody over from the US side, you come in, you throws in a lot of confidence, and you will try to ship like this one project really quickly. At the same time, the European project that's like, oh, we should definitely take a step back and kind of look at our architecture. And that's where like this point system kind of like plays in, right? Because you have people who are like trying to be slightly more careful, and you have people who are trying to like charge ahead. This definitely come to a head. I'm not going to name to a company, not going to name a company, but when you're trying to communicate from one side of the region to another side, right, it's very hard to actually explain this. And when you have this at a within like kind of, and this is like already 3 or 4 years ago, and when you have this, right, in terms of communicating, it's really hard for the team to try to push forward. People have to come in and actually facilitate the difference in terms of how they're thinking. So that definitely did resulted in like, it's not actually a failed initiative, but it resulted in like months and months of delay on an initiative that should have been easily pushed out actually. So that it's painful because months and months of crypto is a long time actually. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Get it what you're saying, and I have had a very similar experience. So at one point I was chasing a big client in South Korea, and I had to spend months and months just to build the
Yes.
relationship so that they would trust me and they would really understand what I'm trying to explain before even talking business, right? Those cultural differences are real, and it always, and I think that's the beauty of it, right? So that's why it's important to have like decentralized communities and teams in different regions, so that so that you can get all of that feedback and understand how things work. Secondly, I think another important thing is to kind of filter down all of these programs and these initiatives to the very core, because at the very core, pretty much everybody is looking to achieve almost the similar objectives, right? So that also eventually helps to drive things forward. But yeah, that's something which again is very common in Web3, because like everybody is working in teams which are sitting across 12, 13, 15 countries. Right?
Yeah,
No,
exactly.
that's interesting. That's interesting. So I think now moving from DeFi, so we have been seeing so many changes, right? So there are a lot of layer ones, layer twos, and now more and more are coming. So, how I imagine it as like these are like different islands, right? And all the islands have created their own economies. Some islands are, they have bright lights and stuff, and people like to go there because there is economic activity happening. Then there are some islands which have really good infra, but nothing really happening there, so people don't like to go and spend time there, right? So that's how I look at different ecosystems, right? So for you, like, what are some of the key things which define this ecosystem gravity? Signals which will tell that this protocol is eventually going to attract builders, capital, and usage, and this protocol is probably not going to do that. Like, what are some of those signals that you look at?
Yeah, I think there are definitely like a couple of telltale signs. So I will just share like my combined strategy and how I approached it. Number one is that like to me, right, when an ecosystem is getting like what you mean like ecosystem, like what you say ecosystem gravity that could attract like builders, capital, and then actually users coming on. I think number one is that the ecosystem itself, right, must have a slant. Like, what is the actual slant of the ecosystem? So, for example, if you were trying to be the best like NFT chain, or you were trying to be the best payments chain, or you're trying to be the best DeFi chain, you have to be able to verbalize the thesis, and you have to be able to sell the thesis. And I think a very important point is that like that team members or people within the ecosystem must all be able to say the same exact thing continuously over and over again for 200 days, basically. Because if people are actually aligned and they actually look at it together in one same united vision, right, that is what can be very sexy to builders, capital, and users. Because when you repeat one thesis that you believe in enough, what will actually happen is that like you can actually start getting like a major wavelength that's going on for a lot of people, and people can actually align and rally around that. So I think that's a large part of the ecosystem like gravity when you think about it. Because if you have people coming from one specific chain or one specific ecosystem, and they're always talking about different things, like for example, if like a product is launching today, and that product is like the chain's most important thing, then everybody definitely has to rally behind it and actually like shout at the top of the lungs, because that's like really critical for the ecosystem. And that product launching has to align with the vision of the ecosystem. So that setting that vision and getting the whole team aligned, I think that's really, really important. From there on, that will flow down into like when you run hackathons, for example, the vision and the thesis that you are using like would align. When you are running, for example, like attracting VCs, for example, you will tell them like, hey, why is my ecosystem doing that? I think I want to draw some parallels to that, to Katana, because at Katana, I really think that's where we actually got right. So what I mean by that is like at Katana, we always tell people that we will have the deepest liquidity and the highest yield, basically. So the team and everybody that's working on Katana kind of like sings the same songs, and everybody really believes in what we are building. And like I think that subscription of that vision is super important. So like leaning into like where the ecosystem and the chain or the environment is like strong at is like really, really important. And from there, right, you'll be able to align the capital. Capital will come in because you have believers. You'll be able to attract builders that actually want to build on top of you because they understand, hey, like if this is for consumer apps, for example, then this is gonna be my home. And then the users are gonna come in because they see like X amount of escape velocity that happens within your ecosystem. And that kind of aligns itself. So getting that top line right is super important actually. That's what I think.
That's critical, and I have like 2 points to add here. So if I were to say the same thing in a slightly different way, it's like, how deeply do you believe in your product, right? So that's very important.
Yes.
If the team is not really convinced of your product, then how are they supposed to convince people who are outside your ecosystem? So that's really important. Second thing, which is really critical, and which this having this clarity in thought and vision, this really helps in qualification. Web3 is a noisy place, right? So
Yes.
much is happening, right? Your Telegram must be filled with messages, hundreds and hundreds of groups and stuff, right? So if the team has a clarity of end objectives and what are you trying to achieve, they can very quickly sift through and qualify those conversations and focus on the things that really matter. Because now, for example, in case of Katana, you have very clear objective, deepest liquidity in DeFi, right? So that's a very clear call that the team has, and then they can kind of qualify and disqualify. And this will be true for any chain out there, right? So that's really interesting. So maybe let's talk more about Katana. If you can give a quick overview of what Katana ecosystem is like, where are you today, and like what are you doing differently in Katana than other DeFi ecosystems? So that would be really awesome to hear.
Yeah, cool, awesome. So I'll share a little bit about Katana. So what Katana is a DeFi specific chain. So we built Katana from the ground up, like just for DeFi, and it's really interesting because when we came together, right, we were looking at like, hey, there's quite a lot of TVL that's floating around in DeFi that's like not productive. That means like, so for example, you might have like DeFi applications holding like 100 or 200 million of TVL, and like the team is going bust. So we kind of like approach DeFi from like, hey, why is this happening and what's actually happening with the DeFi? And we wanted to create a DeFi specific environment that would actually be productive, have the deepest liquidity, and produce the highest use for user, essentially. So these are the first principles that we kind of like designed the chain around. And when we realized when we were designing this environment, right, we also realized that, hey, if we were to do like, we were to like kind of like spread bet in general, it will be very confusing for the users. So I always like to ask people, hey, like what are the three larger chains, DeFi chains that's launched recently? And can you name their top two borrow and lends? And what answers that I end up always getting is that they can't name it. Because what happens is that users, nowadays, DeFi users don't actually care about like individual applications. They care about the full user journey and experience. So what we did at Katana was we said, hey, we would bring our opinions into how we believe a good DeFi journey is going to be. And like when the user comes in, right, they will receive the highest yield and be able to trade with the deepest liquidity. And they kind of like will be entered into an environment that's like highly curated. So that's why we are working with like Morpho for borrow and lend, Sushi for DEX, for example, and like launch pads and a singular launch pad and a singular per DEX. Because what happens when it comes to that point is that like we want users to have the best experience. And when you have a team, right, a labs team that's like purely focused in terms of like with the application teams like giving users the best and most creative experience, you are able to focus and actually like funnel users into the correct apps, and they can actually use DeFi in a way that like they love it essentially. So that's like Katana in a really quick nutshell, actually. Like, and then when we build up in terms of liquidity and DEX utilization, we want the users to be able to participate in DeFi in a very simple way. For example, we don't want them to have to like click 5 buttons or like click 25 buttons in order to accomplish something, which is where it scares away a lot of DeFi users. We want them to go through like a curated experience that would like enable them and empower them to receive the highest use and the deepest liquidity. And like there's quite a lot of things in terms of Katana that we are doing. For example, like we are giving the users like emissions. The participating projects are giving them emissions. We're also giving the users all of the sequencer fees which comes onto like the chain itself. When the user onboards onto the chain, they go through this protocol called bot bridge, where they're able to receive yields coming from L1. And as long as they commit into the main protocols on Katana itself, they will be receiving the use coming from L1 itself. So like it's a mechanical design that we designed from the ground up to kind of like deliver the best experience and the best use to the user, actually. So that's Katana in a nutshell. Yeah.
And that's really important because DeFi user experience for Web3 natives, like crypto natives, it's fine. They can switch through 20 wallets, bridge through 10 different ecosystems, and do whatever is needed to be done to get the maximum yield. But that somewhere has created this friction or barrier to entry for new users to come into DeFi, right? So I always believe that it has to be so simple that anybody could just do it, like without really knowing about what chain it is on, what does a bridge do, how do you swap, how do you bridge to from one ecosystem to another ecosystem, like all of that is fine from a crypto native perspective. Like we right now don't even feel that we are doing something, but when you show somebody who's new to this, it's a big entry barrier. So I think that's great that you have that user experience and creating these incentive models for the user. So I think that's really cool. So I think maybe just a last quick one here. Like, where is DeFi headed? Like, I'm really curious. So I have last to last year, DeFi was like right now. So DeFi is gaining a lot more depth, but the activity that we saw around DeFi summer and those times, like they were really crazy, right? So now I see DeFi maturing a bit, growing into depth. But like, what do you think? Where is it headed next? Like, what's coming in DeFi now?
Yeah, I would say that like, so two major niches kind of like appear to me right now. I think the RWA and stablecoins component, I kind of like group them together because they appear to me as like one really big push that's happening within DeFi right now. So you see, I'm sure you have seen like Circle's IPO, for example. So like that the interest is
Yes.
definitely growing on that front. So stablecoin issuances and RWAs are really like coming in, and they're actually being enabled by a lot of the existing DeFi infrastructure. For example, let's say you were to bring like a money market fund in, right? You could actually now work with like Morpho and the vault creators on Morpho to actually like collateralize those RWAs, when previously like it was very difficult because you needed a way to actually make it work, for example. So vault creators right now could actually like create multiple strategies around a singular RWA, and that would fit within your DeFi U curve if you were thinking of a U curve when you are approaching DeFi from that perspective. And then RWAs coming from outside the market, because it could actually go through this process now, you can actually fill your yield curve with multiple RWAs coming from different types of instruments from TradFi, for example. So that's definitely like a growth point. Like a lot of people are actually pushing towards it. And I think like we would see a lot of growth on that point, definitely when it comes to like DeFi in general. We see that manifested in the form of like Maple, for example, that's doing very well now. You also see that in the form of like, let's say, Athena. You also see that in the form of like multiple applications pushing more towards the RWA side. The other side that I feel that's slightly more like just purely DeFi native is I see the growth of intents and solvers really changing the way how DeFi actually works. So RWA is definitely like an externally driven DeFi play if you think about it. Like you require the buy side and the sell side to come in, and then RWA DeFi becomes like the conduit to monetize, sell, package, and actually manage risk. When it comes to intents and solvers and the way they actually work, right, I feel that a lot of innovation is probably going to come from that front, because if you look at principles of DeFi, right, DeFi has always been about two things. It has always been, number one, the creation of credit. And the same applies to TradFi too. When the founders created ETFs, right, they actually created the potential of creating like a new instrument that could hold on to credit. For example, when you created CDOs, mortgage-backed securities, that's another instrument, for example. The same applies to DeFi. When you create like a new application, you create like a new subcategory that could hold on and actually be a channel for money or for collateral. That's where you would see the most amount of growth. And I think intents are really, really interesting because you actually see intents being sent across from one end or one chain to another chain, from one end to another end at a really quick speed. And we see the speeding out of the intents themselves. So a lot of people currently have the belief that all intents have to be soft. I would like to challenge that notion. And what I mean by that is like, if intents are not soft, they are basically 100% collateral against something that has a spot value. So it's up to the DeFi, everybody within DeFi, to think about how we can speed up transactions and treat intents like checks, for example. And how can we speed up like solver rebalancing and everything on that front? I think that's really interesting. And I think that's where we would see the next like huge push in terms of just DeFi native growth going forward. Yeah. So I think this too was really interesting.
Just adding to that, I am also seeing DeFi being used now as a tool to solve for more traditional problems, right? So RWA is one space that I have also been tracking for quite some time, and the thoughts that you shared it again instigated me to ask a lot more questions. But we can do that sometime later. So, for example, I have a very interesting project, Credible. So, what Credible is doing, they are using DeFi primitives to bring in more traditional capital and solve for the credit problem that we have in emerging markets, right? So very interesting and novel thought, right? So I definitely agree that that's probably a good direction that DeFi is taking right now. Yeah. But this is amazing. I do have a lot more things to talk about, but we are already on time now. But thank you so much for finding time for this, Daniel. It was a pleasure
Hey,
chatting
no
with you.
problem. It's a pleasure. Thanks, Harpreet. Thanks a lot.
Have a good day.